Well, it's the first full week of summer. How do we know that? But I do know that there are a lot of people back in the Midwest who are breathing a sigh of relief because they're thinking maybe this warmer weather might calm things down a little bit and maybe put an end to all of the violent spring storms they were having back there. When I got back from Kansas City a few weeks ago, there were a lot of you folks here who were kind of worried about what was happening back there. A lot of people came up to me and said, well, how was the weather? How was the weather? Because every week we got a report of a bad tornado or flooding or something going on back there. And fortunately, for the time that I was there, everything was relatively calm. A little rain, a little thunder, and that was about it. And indeed, as the weather seems to be warming up, the violent weather seems to be calming down. But of course, we all know that the warmer weather out here just means that it's fire season, right? And the folks in Colorado have been facing those problems, and southern Illinois. Wind, water, fire. 3/4 of the elements are out to get us, one way or another. And a lot of people take it personally. There are a lot of people who think that natural disasters are punishment from God, who controls the weather, and it doesn't seem to bother them one bit that this God who uses weather to punish people has really, really lousy aim. Think about it. All of the really bad tornado outbreaks over, I think, the past 3 years have happened in places that we say are part of what we call the Bible Belt. Filled with church-going people, God-fearing people, and I'm not being flippant about this at all. These are sincere people. They're dedicated to their faith. They pray every day. They read the Bible. They go to church on Sunday. And then, when something like that happens, when the tornado or the flood comes along and some of them die, they go on believing that God still controls the weather. But they figure out ways to let God off the hook. They come up with explanations like, well, we just weren't praying hard enough. Or all of the death and destruction is just part of some higher plan that's too mysterious for us to understand. And I have to tell you, I don't find either of those explanations satisfying in the least. Do you? Yeah. These explanations turn God into an arbitrary and capricious puppet master, pulling the strings. Turns us into puppets. Those explanations, I think, actually serve to shrink and diminish God more than anything else. I don't think I'm going to get run out of town here if I were to suggest that maybe God doesn't control the weather. And maybe we can't use prayer to control God. I don't think that's a real big stretch for most of us here, because we've been around Unity long enough to know that we have a little different way of thinking about God. And we can go back to one of our oldest sources, Lessons in Truth by Emily Cady, and we can find a definition that still works today. So I'm just saying, this is nothing new, but here's what Emily Cady has to say on the subject. She says, God is not a being or person having life, intelligence, love, power. God is that invisible, intangible, but very real something we call life. God is perfect love and infinite power. God is the total of these, the total of all good, whether manifested or unexpressed. There is but one God in the universe, but one source of all the different forms of life or intelligence that we see. That's Emily Cady. And another word that we use that describes what she's talking about there is the word principle. The orderly unfolding of energy and matter according to a set of rules or laws that we're really just beginning to understand. One of the things that we're learning, one of the things we're starting to understand is that in order for there to be life in the universe, some stars had to die. And I don't just mean that the stars had to burn out, but they had to explode. And I mean in a big explosion, in a spectacular fashion that they call a supernova. That's how the building blocks of life were created and then released and spread through the universe so they could become us. In order for there to be life on this planet, we need water, we need a way to stay warm, we need warmth, we need an atmosphere, and those are the things that cause storms and floods as they try to stay in equilibrium according to those rules and natural laws and things like that. They're not evil entities. They're not punishment from God. They're a part of life. And yet, when we feel threatened by natural phenomena, a natural response is to pray. Sometimes the prayers take the form of trying to pray away whatever it is that's threatening us. But is that really effectual? Does that work? There's a story they tell back at Unity Village. This was back in the days when the director of Silent Unity was a woman named May Rowland. And if you've been around Unity for a while, I think she's in the next one here. If any of you have been around Unity for a while, you've probably heard of May Rowland. She was a very powerful and influential figure in the history of our movement. Well, one day there was a tornado warning while May was in the prayer vigil chapel of Silent Unity. And the prayer vigil chapel, it's been in different buildings over the years, but it's always on an upper floor and kind of in a little tower structure that sits up pretty high. It's not the place you want to be during a storm, right? But the neat thing about Unity Village is that all of the buildings are connected by these underground tunnels. They make the best storm shelters. So, instead of going down into the storm shelters, into the tunnels, May Rowland refused to leave the prayer chapel. And instead, she went out on the little balcony that was outside the prayer chapel. And the story goes that you could actually see this funnel cloud touching down and kind of turning into a tornado again. And she looked out at it and she spoke words of truth. Now, I've heard several different versions of what she said, and that's kind of the way it goes with these stories. You know, they take on different forms, but the one I like best is this one. She goes out on the balcony, she sees the tornado off in the distance, and she points off to the side like this, and she says, "You get the hell out of here." Words of truth. And as tornadoes often do, they don't always follow a straight path. This one kind of veered off and went off into the fields and dissipated harmlessly. Okay, now I'm going to put my lawyer hat on, and I feel the need to tell you and everyone who might be listening to me, don't do that. I mean, we just don't realize how fast these suckers can move. And although, you know, I have to confess that whenever a tornado warning would come on when I was living in Illinois in the Midwest, well, the first thing I would do is go outside to take a look. In fact, that's how I got that picture that we showed before, May Rowland's picture there, that one of the ominous looking sky there. Go back a couple. That one right there, that's the one that, yeah, the tornado warning and the sirens went off and I ran outside to get some pictures. Don't do that. But I mean, look at that. I mean, it was nothing came of it, but wow. I mean, there's just nothing like it. You know, there's something that's amazing about the weather phenomena and tornadoes and things like that. They can be deadly, but they're awe-inspiring at the same time. And the thing about May Rowland's approach is that, you know, it's not about her going out and chasing a tornado away. It's about the choice she made in that moment as to how she was going to respond to the situation. She wasn't coming from a place of fear or panic. There's a huge difference between reacting to an event, which is usually where the fear, the anger, the panic come from, and responding to an event in the moment, calling upon a core of calm strength that's within. And as director of Silent Unity, I think it's safe to assume that May Rowland was an expert on the subject of prayer. And I think it's also safe to assume that she had a plan B in place and knew what she was going to do if it were to draw any closer. She was thinking clearly. She was responding. She was not reacting. And she was an expert on the subject of prayer. Now, one of the definitions of prayer that we use a lot in Unity is the one that goes like this. Prayer is creative thinking that changes us, our consciousness, so we can recall the truth of God's presence and power in all situations. We can easily change the last part of that definition to read, so that we can recall the presence and power of principle in all situations. And the reason I do that is because the word God is a trigger word for a lot of people today, because it immediately brings to mind the bearded male figure in the sky who rewards and punishes and controls the weather. I want people to know that there's another way of thinking about it. Another equally valid way of thinking about it. That presence and that power that we call principle pervades every particle of matter, every quantum of energy in the universe, which means that the place where we are closest to principle is, anyone? Right here. Right here. Right here. We don't have to focus out there. It's right here. That's why a lot of our prayer language starts with the invitation to turn within. Back to Emily Cady for a moment. This is something else she wrote. She said, "Hitherto, we have believed that we were helped and comforted by others, that we received joy from outside circumstances and surroundings, but it is not so. All joy and strength and good spring up from a fountain within one's own being. And if we only knew this truth, we should know that because God in us is the fountain out of which springs all our good, nothing that anyone does or says or fails to do or say can take away our joy and good." Now you can tell that was written over 100 years ago, because she says hitherto. Nobody talks like that anymore, do they? Nobody writes like that anymore. And yet, the idea that she captures so eloquently, so brilliantly in this quote, the idea she's expressing is just as true today as it was when she wrote it. So when we combine this with our definition of prayer, what we see is that prayer is a state of consciousness. It is a state of consciousness, and it's a tool that we can use to shift into the state of consciousness. It does all those things. It's no accident that in the adult education program offered by Unity Institute, the spiritual education and enrichment program, it's no accident that the prayer class is called Life of Prayer. Moment by moment, we are faced with the choice of whether we're going to react to life or respond to life. And that goes on across the journey of a lifetime, moment to moment. Now, there's nothing wrong with our instinctive reactions. Sometimes those instinctive reactions can save our lives as we jump out of the way of something that's about to crash into us. But what the great mystics and sages throughout history are teaching us is that we can actually master our instinctive reactions. Whatever might be confronting us, that might be bringing about things like fear or panic or any emotion that might lead to a loss of clarity and focus, in the face of those things that are confronting us, we can learn how to shift into a prayerful state of consciousness that allows us to recall the presence and the power of principle no matter what's happening around us or inside of us. So I want to wrap things up today with what I call the 4 P's of prayer. And we've given you a handout in your bulletin so that you can take this home just as a little reminder of what really goes into the essence of effectual prayer. The 4 P's: principle, positive, personal, and persistent. So, the first P is for principle, which means one presence and one power that always prevails and is the only reality no matter how bad things appear to be. This is the starting place in using prayer as a consciousness conditioning tool. We first remember that it is about principle, and that's the first thing that we affirm. The second P, that one is for positive. And we like to say that the most effective way to pray is to use positive language, which says that we already have what it is that we might be looking for in that situation. We can say something like, in the face of this threat, I have the wisdom and power to respond creatively and effectively. I have the wisdom and power to respond creatively and effectively in the face of this threat. Doesn't have to be flowery. Doesn't have to be lengthy, just a solid, short, easy to remember statement of truth that you can use in just about any situation. The third P is for personal. And this is a reminder that we're working on ourselves. We're working with our own consciousness. We're not trying to change conditions out there. It all starts within. Using the words of Emily Cady, all joy and strength and good spring up from a fountain within my own being. It's about my consciousness. And finally, the fourth P is for persistent. We have to keep at it on a regular basis, gradually working up to the point where we have an almost constant awareness of where our consciousness is dwelling from moment to moment. And you probably all know what I'm going to say about how you practice that persistently, don't you? Meditation. There's no better tool. It takes practice. And we all know how to meditate. Start by closing our eyes. We get still. It's not about stopping our thoughts. A lot of people think, oh, meditation is about stopping my thoughts, and because I can't stop my thoughts, I'm a failure at meditating. Don't do that to yourselves. It's not about stopping our thoughts. We get to notice our thoughts. We get still. We notice our thoughts. We don't fight them. Sometimes we let them run, and we bring our attention back to whatever it is we're using as our focus, whether it's the breath coming in and out. Sometimes we count the breath. Sometimes we use a sacred word to act as a special focus. And if we're persistent, here's where the practice and persistence comes in. If we're persistent, those running thoughts calm down. They slow down. We reach a state of consciousness that's wider, it's deeper. Instead of a bunch of wild thoughts jangling around, we experience something that's more subtle, more peaceful. Eventually we can become a witness to our thoughts, and then eventually the thoughts simply fall away. It's an amazing thing. If we're persistent, we will learn how to stop any thought or reaction in the moment dead in its tracks. We can question it, and then we can intentionally decide what course we're going to follow. It happens in an instant. Can you see how that might be useful? To be able to pause in the moment, stop the thought, and sometimes we're even aware of what's going to happen before it happens. I mean, in terms of our own reaction. We know what's coming in this situation, and we get ahead of it. And then we creatively decide how we are going to respond to what the moment has to offer. I'm going to be starting another meditation class in September, back when the kids are back in school, and maybe people won't be traveling so much. But don't wait till then. Start now. See you next week.